Subscribe for more horror stories and comment below, where are you listening from?
It was past midnight when Jordan boarded the Red Line 914 commuter train. The platform was nearly empty, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic crunch of his shoes on the concrete. He had missed the earlier train home due to a late shift to the hospital, and this was the last ride of the night. The train screeched into the station like it was dragging something unwilling behind it. As the doors slid open, Jordan noticed something peculiar. Every carriage was lit, but not a single soul was visible inside. No other passengers, no staff, no movement. Still, the announcement echoed over the intercom. Next stop, Timber Ridge Station. He stepped on board. Inside, everything felt off. Not broken, just wrong. The lighting flickered too slowly. The seat cushions were unusually pristine, and the air smelled like ozone and old cologne. Jordan sat down near the middle of the car and tried to shake off the unease. That's when he saw him. At the far end of the car stood a conductor, tall, wearing a deep navy uniform, complete with the traditional cap. His face was hidden behind a thick shadow cast by the brim. He wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still near the doors, facing Jordan. Jordan gave a polite nod. No response. Then the conductor raised one hand and gently tapped the emergency brake lever. But the train didn't stop. Instead, it sped up. Jordan stood, gripping the pole. "Hey, what are you doing?" No answer. The conductor stepped out of the car, except the doors never opened. It was as if he simply phased through them. Jordan rushed to the front of the car to try and alert someone. When he reached the conductor's door, it was locked. There was no one inside. He peered through the small window into the driver's compartment. Only darkness. The intercom crackled to life again. This time, the voice wasn't calm or robotic. It was raspy, almost angry. "Next stop, nowhere." Jordan backed away, heart pounding. The train flew past 3 stops without slowing down. The windows blurred with speed, showing only endless tunnel and the occasional burst of sparks. Jordan tried the emergency intercom, but all it gave him was static, and then something worse. A voice, his own voice, repeating his last words back to him. "Hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? He stumbled into the next car, hoping to find anyone. But it was just the same. Pristine seats, flickering lights, and that smell like damp ash and perfume left in a locked room for years. And then he saw him again. The conductor. Only this time, he was sitting in Jordan's seat. Jordan blinked. The man's head was slowly turning toward him, but the face, there was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth, just a black void where a face should be. And he was holding something. Jordan's hospital ID badge. He hadn't even realized it was missing. Without thinking, Jordan ran. Car after car, locked, empty wrong. In one, he found a woman's purse, resting perfectly upright on a seat. But there was dust all over it, like it had been there for years. In another car, there was a spilled cup of coffee that was still steaming, despite no one being around. Eventually, he found a car that was dimmer than the others. And it were suitcases, jackets, even cell phones scattered across seats, but no people. As if the passengers had simply vanished mid-journey. Suddenly, the train jerked violently. Jordan was thrown to the ground. And over the intercom came the final announcement. "End of the line. Please disembark." The doors opened onto nothing. Just blackness. No platform. No lights. No city. Jordan stayed on the floor, trembling, listening to the silence. Then, footsteps. Measured. Heavy. Coming closer. The conductor. He stepped through the door and stood over Jordan, looking down at him with that empty face. Then he spoke for the first time, not through his mouth, but inside Jordan's mind. "You boarded a train running on borrowed time." Jordan screamed, but the sound never left his throat. There's a railway tunnel just outside the town of Elmbrook that no train has passed through in over 40 years. It's hidden by overgrowth now. Thorny brush and vines choking the archway like nature trying to erase something man was never meant to build. Most locals avoid it, not out of superstition, but because of what they call the pressure, a strange, inexplicable weight people feel in their chest if they stand near it too long. Some say it's just the tight, damp air. Others say it's something else entirely. Back in the late 70s, that tunnel was part of a nightly cargo route between two states. But in 1983, after a derailment near the far end left 3 rail workers unaccounted for, the route was shut down permanently. The wreckage was cleared, but no bodies were ever recovered. The official report said the men may have wandered off in shock. Unofficially, locals started telling stories about hearing voices from inside the tunnel, pleas for help, screams that faded into static, and sometimes laughter. Not the joyful kind, either. The kind of laughter that sounds forced, panicked. In 2019, a young urban explorer named Theo posted a short video on a fringe forum. It showed him standing at the mouth of the tunnel just after dusk, nervously joking about local legends while his flashlight flickered. Then he stepped inside. The video cuts off 4 minutes later, mid-sentence. The audio garbles as if the microphone had shorted. Theo was never seen again. Police wrote it off as a runaway case. But here's where it gets strange. 3 weeks after that video, an Amtrak surveillance crew running diagnostics on nearby lines picked up an audio signal. It sounded like a broken radio transmission. When analyzed, it revealed a fragmented voice whispering, "I didn't walk in alone." The clip was dismissed as corrupted data until 2 months later when hikers found a rusted train coupling just inside the tunnel. It was heavily weathered, but engraved with the number 737, the same train involved in the 1983 derailment. There was no explanation for how it ended up back in the tunnel. All known parts had been scrapped decades earlier. Over the years, more anomalies surfaced. Cell service vanishes completely within 20 feet of the tunnel. Cameras either stop recording or capture nothing but pitch black, even with night vision. One paranormal researcher left a recorder running overnight inside. What it captured was chilling. A 7-minute loop of a voice, faint and distant, repeating a single question. "Did they send you to fix the lights?" No one had mentioned anything about lights in any reports. Not until a retired conductor named Harris came forward in 2022. He claimed he was on the final run before the shutdown and saw something inside the tunnel, something he never reported. According to Harris, just before the derailment, the train's headlights flickered and then completely cut out. As they slowed, something stepped onto the tracks. He said it looked like a man, but wrong. Its arms were too long, and it didn't blink. It didn't move out of the way. It just stood there grinning. When asked why he hadn't come forward earlier, Harris said, "Because I still hear it. In my sleep. Asking if I'm here to fix the lights." He passed away 6 months later. Natural causes. But his daughter said he had started covering every mirror in the house. Said he couldn't bear to see his own reflection anymore. There's a theory, one that feels more like folklore, but fits the evidence. They say the tunnel wasn't abandoned. It was sealed, not because of a derailment, but because something got on board that night. Something not human. And when the train crashed, it didn't just vanish. It stayed behind waiting, but not waiting to be found, waiting to recruit. Some believe the voices people hear inside are echoes of the missing, calling out, warning others not to come closer. Others believe those voices aren't victims at all, but bait. And here's the part no one can explain. There's no official record of what caused the derailment. No brake failure, no obstruction, no mechanical issue. The train simply stopped responding, as if something else had taken control. Some who've dared to walk into the tunnel swear they've seen the faint glow of cabin lights deep in the dark, just out of reach. Some follow them, thinking they're hallucinations. But none of those people have ever made it out the other side. And every so often, at exactly 3:37 a.m., the same time the derailment was logged, you can still hear the screech of metal on rusted tracks echoing from the hills outside Elmbrook. But no train ever comes. At 12:47 a.m. on a quiet Thursday night, 27-year-old Lena Corwin boarded the last train out of Marlow Station, an unassuming platform tucked behind a shuttered industrial park in upstate New York. The surveillance footage, which was later released during the search, shows her stepping into the third car of train 447. Alone, she looked calm, no signs of distress. No one followed her. But here's where things unravel. That was the last time anyone ever saw her. There's something deeply unsettling about train stations after midnight. They're designed for motion and people, yet at that hour, they become empty corridors of forgotten sound. The hum of lights, the distant echo of rails groaning, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, the distinct sense that something is watching you. According to the conductor's log, Train 447 departed right on time and made all its usual stops. Nothing was reported out of the ordinary. But when investigators checked the passenger manifests and onboard footage, Lena simply wasn't there. No one remembered seeing her. Not the conductors, not the late-night commuters, not even the ticket scanner. It's as if she stepped into the train and into another layer of reality. Here's where the story deepens. Lena was a cartographer by profession, an urban planner obsessed with the forgotten corners of infrastructure. In the weeks before her disappearance, she'd been mapping defunct subway lines and obscure train routes from the early 1900s. Her journal, found at her apartment, was filled with hand-drawn diagrams and annotations about ghost routes, phantom tunnels, and something she labeled only as the unscheduled line. It seems Lena believed there were trains that no longer appeared on any map, lines that still operated under certain conditions, usually around 3 a.m., always in places marked for demolition, and never acknowledged by transit authorities. Her notes mention something called the threshold conductor, a figure she claims guides the unaware into the wrong train when the timing aligns. She didn't say what happened to those passengers, only that they were redirected. At first glance, this sounds like an unraveling mind. But here's the twist. A week after her disappearance, an anonymous envelope was delivered to the police. Inside was a photo, grainy, old-fashioned, with time-worn edges. It showed a woman in early 20th century clothing standing on a train platform. Her face was unmistakable. It was Lena. Only now, she wore a distant, vacant expression. The caption beneath reads simply, Marlow Line, 1911. Investigators dismissed it as a hoax. But digital analysts noted the photo was taken using a photographic process discontinued in the 1930s. And the paper it was printed on matched materials from that exact period. So, how do you explain that? Some theorize Lena somehow slipped into an abandoned stretch of rail, still lingering in some parallel layer of time. There are known cases, albeit rare, of electromagnetic interference near decommissioned train yards, causing anomalies in both perception and navigation. Could she have walked into a space between coordinates? Others believe in something more ancient. Railways have long been associated with liminality, boundaries between places, between times. The very act of travel is a ritual, a transition. If you board the wrong train at the wrong time, who's to say where or when you might end up? There's an eerie passage Lena wrote in her journal that sticks with me. Some tracks are not made of steel. Some trains run on memory and loss. And some conductors never left the first route they were assigned. The last chilling detail, every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a single train is spotted passing through Marlow Station at 12:47 a.m. There are no scheduled trains at that hour. The footage always shows a blur, a shape where a train should be, passing too fast, with no sound and no passengers. Except sometimes a figure is visible in the third car. A woman, standing still, looking out the window. Her expression, empty, timeless, as if she's waiting for someone to notice. It was just after 2 a.m. when the maintenance crew first reported the sound. They were working a routine overnight shift along the Northern Ridge Line, inspecting the rails near an old stretch known as Mile Marker 66. The area was remote, shadowed by pine-covered slopes and a steep ravine on one side. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the screaming. At first, they thought it was a mountain lion, but as they approached the stretch of track, the howls turned unmistakably human, drawn-out wails echoing through the trees. Then, as suddenly as they began, they stopped. Just silence and the churring of insects. Later that morning, they filed a report, but nothing came of it. Animals, maybe wind, they were told. But in the months that followed, more incidents began surfacing. Night engineers operating the 1245 westbound freight started requesting alternate routes, citing disturbances at mile 66. One conductor described seeing a passenger car sitting alone on the tracks, disconnected, aged, and still. When the train approached, the car vanished. No trace on satellite or signal logs. He didn't return to work after that. Eventually, the company sealed the old mile marker gate and rerouted the line. But by then, the legend had already spread, the screaming carriage of mile marker 66. In 1998, a rail historian named Lucas Frey dug into the site's past, curious about the reports. What he found only deepened the mystery. In 1933, a small private commuter train derailed at that very curve. All cars were accounted for, except one, carriage 4B. According to surviving blueprints and manifest logs, it held 16 passengers and one steward. No bodies were ever recovered, and no wreckage matching carriage for B was ever located. The railway company quietly erased the incident from its records, citing incomplete documentation due to a fire at the Central Archive later that year. But survivors of the derailment told another story. One claimed he saw 4B tip unnaturally, almost as if pulled by an unseen force, before disconnecting mid-curve and disappearing into the fog. He remembered hearing screaming, but not from the passengers, from the carriage itself. Like the train was alive, he wrote, and it was in pain. Modern witnesses tell similar tales. One engineer, traveling solo, said he saw an old carriage ahead on the track, stationary. As he neared, he noticed frost on the windows, even though it was summer. Inside, the lights flickered and then revealed blurred, pale faces staring outward in unison, mouths open in silent agony. But when he passed the spot, there was nothing. No debris, no reflection, no damage on the track recorder. He quit 3 days later. Rail workers have developed unspoken rules. Never blow the horn near mile 66. Never look directly into the woods on either side of the track. And if you hear a scream that sounds like steel tearing, keep going no matter what. One of the strangest encounters came from a passenger. A woman riding the midnight line said she dozed off during the trip and woke up alone in a different carriage than she started in. This one was old. Brass fixtures, crimson velvet seats, gaslit sconces lining the walls. No announcements, no movement, just the feeling of stillness. When she looked out the window, there was nothing. No landscape, no lights, just white. When she finally cried out, the windows shattered. Then she blinked and found herself back in her original seat, shaking and soaked in sweat. But perhaps the most unsettling report was submitted by a signal technician who accessed archived infrared recordings near the marker. The camera, active for a brief window one night, caught something unusual, a heat signature in the shape of a carriage hovering inches above the track, moving slowly against the direction of time-stamped train traffic. Inside, he swore he saw several figures standing perfectly still. No motion, just watching. The data corrupted seconds after playback. So what exactly is the screaming carriage? Some believe it's a time slip, an echo of a train that never completed its journey, stuck in a loop of final moments. Others think the carriage was never built to transport people at all, but something else, something that fed on the fear of motion, the liminal space between departure and arrival. A more psychological theory suggests it's a mass projection, rail workers under immense stress, tapping into a collective trauma. But if that's the case, how do you explain the sightings from hikers? From unrelated passengers? From machines? The truth may be even simpler and more terrifying. What if Carriage 4B is still trying to arrive? Daniel had always found something calming about trains. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the sterile flicker of fluorescent lights, the subtle way time seemed to stretch and fold between stations. It was a routine he clung to. Same 7:03 p.m. train. Same window seat, car 4, seat A2. A quiet ritual in a chaotic world. But on this particular Thursday evening, something was off. The platform was unusually quiet. No chatter, no announcements. Even the wind felt muffled, as if the world were holding its breath. When the train pulled up, it was precisely on time, yet eerily silent. No screech of brakes. No conductor's call. He boarded anyway. The interior was dimmer than usual. Pale, blue emergency lights hummed above like underwater halos. As he stepped into car 4, a shiver bloomed at the base of his neck. Every seat was empty, except one. His seat. Someone was already sitting there. From the back, the figure seemed familiar. Same dark pea coat, same tousled brown hair. As Daniel stepped closer, the resemblance sharpened. Same build, same slight tilt of the head. "Hey," he said, voice catching in his throat. "I think you're in my seat." The man didn't turn. Daniel hesitated, then moved to the side, trying to get a look at the stranger's face. And when he finally did, his knees went weak. It was him. Same nose, same lips, same scar under the left eyebrow from a childhood bike accident. The man in his seat looked exactly like Daniel. But there was something horribly wrong. The eyes. They were pale, washed out, almost unfinished, like someone had sketched them in haste and forgotten to color them fully. They stared straight ahead, unblinking, unseeing. Daniel staggered back, heart racing. "Who are you?" he demanded. The doppelganger turned its head slowly toward him. The mouth curled into a smile, but not a warm one. It was clinical, like a predator mimicking emotion. Then it spoke. "You're late." The lights above flickered. The train jerked forward, hard. Daniel stumbled and grabbed onto a nearby pole. When he looked up again, the figure was gone. The seat was empty. His seat. Confused and shaken, Daniel sat down anyway, convincing himself it was some sort of hallucination. Fatigue, maybe. Stress. That's all. The train ride would be short. He'd be home soon. But the train didn't stop. Station after station blurred past. The signs outside became unreadable, warped like heat haze. The passengers, what few had boarded, never moved. Some sat like mannequins. Others wore vacant expressions, mouths slightly open as if mid-sentence, frozen in time. Daniel's phone showed no signal. The time flickered between 7:18 and 7:18. Every attempt to contact someone failed. Even the emergency call button didn't respond. Then a whisper, low and sharp, brushing past his ear like cold breath. "This is not your seat." He turned. Nothing. Across the aisle, a mirror-like window reflected his image, but something was wrong. His reflection wasn't synced. It stared back at him even when he turned his head. And then it moved its hand. Before he did, Daniel stood and walked through the train cars, searching for the conductor and attendant, anyone. But every door led to the same car he'd just left. Over and over, like a looping nightmare. Car 4, seat A2. And every time he returned, the doppelganger was waiting. Each time, it looked more complete. The eyes gained color. The voice grew stronger. The last time Daniel saw it, it leaned forward and whispered, "Thank you for making room." The train screeched to a halt. He was thrown to the floor. Lights burst back into their regular, sterile glow. When Daniel looked up, people were boarding again, chatting, scrolling on their phones. The car was normal. He stood slowly, dazed. A conductor passed by, giving him a strange look. "Sir, you all right? You missed your stop." End of the line. Daniel looked around. The sign outside the window simply read Terminus. No city, no code. When he finally stepped off the train, the air felt wrong. Too still. No sound except the dull hum of the engine behind him. The station was empty, clean but unused, like a stage set built for no audience. And as he turned toward the windows of the train, he saw someone watching him from inside, sitting in seat A2, his face smiling. Was Daniel trapped in a parallel loop? Had he been replaced? Or worse, was he always the copy, and the real Daniel had already left that seat long ago? Train travel is often symbolic. Movement, transformation, transition between realms. But what happens when the journey never ends? When the destination is not a place, but a version of yourself you were never meant to meet? Some believe that places like Terminus are real, not made of metal and maps, but memory and error. A liminal space where the rules break and the passengers forget they were ever passengers at all. So next time you board a late-night train and find someone in your seat, look closely. It might be you, but it might not be your turn to sit. It was a red-eye route through the Appalachian foothills, The kind of train ride where silence wasn't a luxury, it was a burden. The cars rattled endlessly, their sound echoing off the narrow walls like whispers trying to escape. It was just after 2 a.m., somewhere between two forgotten rural stations, when Car 7 became a stage for something no one could explain. There weren't many passengers on the train that night. A few college students asleep with earbuds in, a woman cradling a caged cat, and then there was him. No one knew where he boarded. No one remembered seeing him at any of the previous stops. He was just suddenly there, mid-car, aisle seat, staring out into the night through a smeared window. Tan coat, leather gloves, a fedora that sat too tightly on his skull, as if it were holding something in. He didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't even blink, according to a teenage girl sitting 2 rows behind. It was like he had grown there. A conductor came through to check tickets. When he reached the man, he paused. The scanner glitched. It emitted a single mechanical chirp before powering down completely. The conductor tried again. Nothing. The scanner rebooted without issue for every other passenger, but not for him. Finally, the conductor asked for a paper ticket. The man slowly turned to look at him, face completely blank. He raised a gloved finger and gently tapped the window beside him once. Tap! And then he turned back to the glass. The conductor, rattled, moved on. The girl in the back, her name was Lydia, tried not to look at the man again. But she noticed something odd. Whenever they passed through a patch of complete darkness, where the only light came from inside the car, his reflection didn't match his movements. Once, she saw him turn his head, but his reflection remained completely still staring out at her. Then the temperature in the car dropped. Subtly, like a breath passing over your skin in a dream. One of the college students woke up and remarked, "Did the heater go out?" But the thermostat near the exit still read 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's when it happened. As the train barreled through the night at 60 miles per hour, the man stood. His movements were sharp, too fluid, like a recording being fast-forwarded. He walked down the aisle with his head slightly tilted, shoulders unmoving, feet not quite lifting. Lydia thought his legs moved wrong, like the knees bent too far or not at all. Without saying a word, he approached the door at the end of the car, the emergency exit between cars, locked and sealed while in motion. But the lock unlatched. No one saw him touch it. It just released with a soft click, and the heavy door creaked open into the cold blur of darkness and wind. He stepped through, one foot, then the other. Gone. No thud, no scream, no sudden brakes or emergency alerts. He simply walked off a moving train. The conductor was called. Panic rippled through the car. They stopped the train several minutes later, reversed course, and searched the tracks. Nothing. Not a shred of clothing. Not a drop of blood. Not even footprints along the gravel ballast. It was as if he had stepped off into nowhere. Security footage was pulled from Car 7. What they found only deepened the mystery. There he was, sitting, watching the window. But when the camera caught the moment he stood, his face glitched. The image corrupted in a jagged smear. The figure distorted, then stuttered out of frame. When the door opened, the frame went black. For exactly 13 seconds. When the feed returned, the man was gone. The strangest part? He had never cast a shadow in any of the footage. Not once. Amtrak ran a full internal investigation. They combed passenger logs, cross-referenced manifests from every boarding station, even reviewed maintenance worker reports. There was no record of anyone matching his description being on board. He hadn't bought a ticket, hadn't passed any surveillance, hadn't left any trace at all. The news didn't cover it. There was a quiet payoff, according to one of the attendants, an NDA hush that blanketed the entire train crew. It wasn't a threat, more like a warning. Lydia, now in her 20s, later shared the story in a paranormal forum under a pseudonym. She claims the man wasn't human, that he was something watching us from the seams. She still has dreams about him, always on the same train, always looking out that window. In her most recent nightmare, he finally turned to face her. His mouth was wide open, stretched into a grotesque, silent laugh. She woke up with the sound of train horns screaming in her ears, and a smear of condensation on her bedroom window, with a single gloved fingerprint in the center. Trains represent movement, transition, and progress, symbolic veins through the spine of human civilization. But when one steps off that track, what are they rejecting? Time? Space? Reality? This man's exit wasn't just physical, it was ontological. A rejection of the known world, a departure from linear time. The fact that no one saw where he came from or where he went suggests he was never truly on board in the first place. He might have been something ancient, something not bound by tracks or logic, something using the train as a conduit. Maybe he wasn't walking off the train at all. Maybe he was returning to wherever he came from. And if that's true, you have to ask, how many times have we brushed shoulders with things pretending to be human, waiting for just the right moment to step back into nowhere? It started on a Thursday, late enough that most of the station lights were dimmed, early enough that the air still buzzed with leftover city heat. Mason boarded the 11:57 p.m. westbound train like he did every week after his graveyard shift at the packaging plant. Bleary-eyed, earbuds in, same seat, third car from the front. It was routine, comforting, until that night. He didn't notice the first oddity until they passed Lockwell Junction. Normally, the train sped through, a quick blur of iron girders and flickering lamps. But this time the train slowed. Not just a brake check either, an actual deceleration. Outside the window, the old freight yard crept past, soaked in moonlight and overgrown with weeds that had no business growing in November. Mason pulled one earbud out and squinted. The intercom crackled to life. Next stop, Graybridge. Graybridge? That wasn't on the route. There was no Graybridge. He blinked, waiting for the announcement to correct itself, for some glitchy AI voice to chime in with a real stop. But the intercom remained silent. Even the other passengers seemed unfazed, heads buried in phones, chins resting on palms, some already half asleep. Mason rubbed his eyes, shrugged it off, and leaned back. The train rolled to a smooth stop. Outside, fog, thick and motionless like it had weight. The kind of fog that seemed painted onto the windows. A station sign loomed through it in faded green letters. Graybridge, EST 1887. Mason stood and stepped closer to the window. Beyond the platform, there were no lights, no roads, no cars, just the skeletal silhouette of a covered bridge. Its roof collapsed inward, stretching into woods far too dense to exist between Lockwell and Mercer. The doors hissed open. No one got on, but a chill crawled in. It was subtle, like a draft in a sealed room. A metallic scent, like wet iron. The lights in the train flickered once, then held steady. Mason sat back down, shaken. He checked his phone. No service. No time displayed. Just a blinking battery symbol. Though, would have been at 78% before he boarded. When the train started again, it moved with a strange rhythm, like the rails underneath had warped. Every few seconds, the floor would jitter or bounce, as if the train was riding over uneven ground. Mason looked out the window again. The city lights were gone. Now only endless woods hugged both sides of the track, trees so tall and close they looked like prison bars. Then he saw something, a figure, standing beside the tracks, facing the train. Pale face, dark clothes. No flashlight, no movement. Just standing, arms at their sides, barely illuminated by the cabin lights as the train passed. Mason's breath caught in his throat. 30 seconds later, another. Same stance, same place, same stillness. And again, dozens. He glanced around, expecting someone else to react. But no one did. A woman across the aisle was asleep, mouth open, head leaning against the vibrating glass. The man beside her was flipping through a magazine, slowly. Too slowly. Page paused, page pause. Another figure outside. This one was closer. Too close. Mason pressed his forehead to the glass, and the figure turned. Just slightly. Enough to show its profile. It was his own face. Expressionless. Mouth slightly open. And as the train passed, he thought he saw it smile. Not out of joy, but recognition. His stomach turned. He stood up and made his way to the conductor's car. The doors opened easily. The lights here were dimmer, humming with that sickly fluorescent yellow. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. A long silence. Then, not much longer now. The voice was muffled, old, dry like paper dragged across stone. Mason stepped back. The door remained shut. You weren't supposed to notice. That wasn't the conductor's voice. It came from behind. He turned. The passengers in the nearest cabin were all looking at him. Not moving, not blinking, just watching. Mason backed away and sprinted through the cars, passing rows of seats with passengers frozen like wax figures. Eyes glazed, some mouths open mid-sentence. One child was holding a toy train in his lap, except the toy was rusted, broken, the kind of thing you'd find buried in a junkyard. The child's smile was fixed, skin pale, fingernails black. Mason stopped running. Something was wrong with the space itself. He'd passed car 3 at least twice now, but the labels never changed. Car 3. Always car 3. The train was looping him. He took a seat and stared at the emergency brake. Then a whisper brushed his ear. They don't like it when you try to leave. He jerked up. No one was there. The lights dimmed further, flickering like candlelight. Outside, a new station was approaching. Dunwood Crossing, POP 0. The platform was cracked and overgrown. A sign dangled from rusted chains. And there, standing dead center on the platform, was the figure again. His double. Only this time, the thing waved. Just once. And the train stopped. The doors opened. And Mason was no longer sure if he had ever boarded the right train at all. It was the last train of the night, and the air was thick with the kind of stillness that only comes when the world has gone to sleep. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, making every creak of the train and every rattle of the track seem louder than they should. Ben had ridden this route for years, but tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the chill that had settled in his bones, or the oppressive sense that something was about to happen. He sat by the window, as he always did, watching the city lights blur into nothingness as the train sliced through the darkness. He wasn't alone, of course. The train was never truly empty at this hour. But tonight, the usual commuters, the tired faces, the quiet sighs, were replaced with an unsettling quiet. There was only one other person in his car, a girl sitting across from him. She couldn't have been older than 17, maybe 18. She wore a faded hoodie and jeans, her hair messy, but not in a careless way. More like she'd been running her fingers through it for hours. Her eyes were glued to her phone, but every few minutes she would look up, scanning the train. It wasn't the kind of glance you give when you're just passing time. It was the kind of look someone gives when they're waiting for something. Ben tried to ignore her. After all, it wasn't uncommon for people to be a little strange on late-night trains. But when she suddenly stood up and started walking toward the door at the far end of the car, something about her fell off. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and the girl stepped out onto the platform at the next station. The train was still moving, and it wasn't scheduled to stop here. She was supposed to stay on board, but she stepped off anyway, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Ben blinked, his heart racing. The train passed through the station, its lights briefly illuminating the girl standing alone on the platform, the cold night air swirling around her. She didn't seem to mind the chill or the isolation. Minutes passed. Ben tried to shake the feeling of unease creeping up his spine. He glanced around the train. Nobody else had noticed. As the train neared the next stop, he told himself that maybe it was nothing. Maybe she had just been at the wrong station, or maybe she was just someone who got off at odd times. But as the train slowed and the doors opened again, there she was. The girl, standing at the far end of the car. This time, she wasn't looking at her phone. She was staring at him. Ben's breath caught in his throat. She hadn't gotten back on the train after the last stop. How was she here? Was she even the same person? She didn't seem to notice his confusion. Her eyes were wide, almost empty, as if she was looking through him, not at him. The train doors closed, and the sound of the whistle echoed through the silence. The train began to move again, leaving the station behind. She was standing there, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just stepped off the train only moments ago. Ben didn't know what to do. His fingers gripped the armrest, his knuckles white. He tried to avoid her gaze, but her presence seemed to draw him in. A part of him wanted to speak, to ask her what she was doing. But another part of him, an instinctive part, knew better than to engage. There was something unnatural about her, something not quite right. The train continued to its next stop. The girl stood still, motionless as a statue, her eyes fixed on him like a magnet pulling him closer. But this time, when the train slowed down, she didn't move. She didn't even flinch. Ben's throat was dry. He couldn't tear his eyes away. He had to know what was going on. What was she doing? Why was she doing it? The train came to a complete stop, and the doors opened. The girl stood there, her eyes wide, unmoving. Ben felt the urge to run. He wanted to get up, to leave the car, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen. He glanced out the window to the station platform. There were no lights, no signs, just an empty, shadowy landscape. The girl slowly started walking towards the door again, her steps deliberate. But this time, she didn't leave the train. She stepped into the aisle, walking towards the front of the car. Her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were listening for something, waiting for something. Ben watched her with a sense of dread pooling in his stomach. He had to get off. He couldn't stay on this train. He couldn't be near her. He stood up abruptly, pushing past her. She didn't even look at him. Her focus was still ahead, toward the front of the car. The train lurched as it began to move again, and Ben could feel his pulse quickening. His eyes darted to the windows, and for a split second, he thought he saw something. Something standing on the platform. Something waiting. He stumbled as he rushed toward the door, desperate to get off at the next station. But when the train came to a stop, it was the same station. The platform was empty, as it had been before. He stepped off, his heart racing, his legs shaky. He turned to look back at the train, just in time to see the girl's face pressed against the window, staring at him from inside. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes were dark, hollow. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, she was gone. Ben stood frozen on the platform, the echo of the train's whistle ringing in his ears. The lights flickered, and the train began to move again. He watched it disappear into the night. But as it pulled away, the unease in his chest only grew. He turned to the empty station, feeling the weight of something unspoken pressing in on him. There was something about that girl, something wrong, something deeply wrong. As the train faded into the distance, the silence swallowed him whole. The midnight train was quiet, save for the faint rattle of its wheels on the tracks. It was an old locomotive, one of the last of its kind, moving through a desolate stretch of countryside. The passengers, a handful of commuters, sat quietly, lost in their thoughts, unaware of the strange presence lurking in the depths of the train. The air in the carriages was heavy, thick with a musty scent of age and dust. The flickering overhead lights added to the oppressive atmosphere, casting shadows that seemed to move in time with the train's rocking motion. It was a long ride, and most of the passengers had drifted off into uneasy slumbers, the rhythmic motion of the train lulling them into a false sense of security. But beneath them, in the bowels of the train, something stirred. The engine room was locked off from the rest of the train. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember, its access restricted to only the most trusted crew members. Most passengers never even noticed the sealed door at the far end of the platform. But tonight, something was different. It started with a low hum, barely audible at first. It grew steadily louder, a vibration that seemed to pulse through the entire train. The few remaining passengers in the last car shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing around as the sound deepened into something wrong. The hum was almost too much to ignore now, as if it was alive, throbbing in rhythm with the train. And then the lights flickered, a series of sharp blinks that left the train in total darkness for a moment, before the dull yellow glow returned. A man named Alan, an experienced traveler who had taken this route countless times, was the first to notice the figure. He was seated near the window, staring absently out into the night, when a shadow appeared in the corner of his vision. It wasn't much, just a fleeting shape, a silhouette moving quickly through the small window that led to the engine room. He blinked, thinking it was his imagination playing tricks. But as the shadow passed again, this time more slowly, Alan's heart skipped a beat. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form stretched and twisted as though it had been molded from the shadows themselves. There was no clear definition to its shape, but its presence was unmistakable. It was like a distortion in the air, as if the very fabric of reality had been bent around it. Alan's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to call for the conductor, but when he glanced around, he saw that no one else seemed to have noticed. The other passengers remained oblivious, lost in their own worlds or deep in sleep. With trembling hands, Alan reached for the overhead compartment to steady himself. The train creaked as if it had been disturbed by something ancient, something far older than the metal rails it traveled on. The figure in the window grew clearer, and Alan could see that it wasn't just a shadow, it had a face. The face was featureless, just a smooth, almost porcelain-like surface, pale and devoid of any expression. But Alan could feel its eyes on him, those invisible eyes, watching, observing, waiting. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Alan stared at the window, heart racing. His mind told him to dismiss it as a trick of the light or fatigue, but his gut screamed otherwise. The train hummed louder now, the sound vibrating through his bones. It was no longer just a noise, it was a warning. He stood up, feeling the weight of the train's motion like never before. The hall outside the car seemed longer than it had when he boarded, the shadows stretching in all directions. He had to know what was happening. He couldn't just sit there and pretend nothing was wrong. Alan stepped into the dimly lit corridor and moved toward the back of the train. The air grew colder with each step, the temperature dropping sharply as he approached the door to the engine room. The vibration, that low hum, was louder here, almost deafening. The closer he got, the more it felt like the walls were closing in on him. He reached for the door handle, but it was locked, the heavy metal resisting his touch. There was no way to open it from the outside. He banged on the door with his fist, his frustration mounting. He had to know what was inside. Had the figure come from there? Was it real, or was it just his mind unraveling? Suddenly, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Alan's heartbeat was the only sound he could hear now, pounding in his chest like a drum. He stood frozen, staring at the door, unsure what to do next. And then, as if on cue, the door creaked open. The room beyond was dark, the only illumination coming from the flickering light above. The engine room was vast, a cavernous space filled with old machinery and forgotten tools. But it wasn't the machinery that caught Alan's attention. It was the figure standing in the middle of the room. It was taller now, fully formed. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something else, something more. Its face was still featureless, but now it had a presence that filled the room, an aura of malevolence that seemed to suck the very light from the space around it. Alan took a step back, but his legs refused to move. His body was frozen, as though the very air around him had thickened, weighed him down. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's head tilted, as if studying him. Its movements were unnaturally fluid, its body bending in ways that should have been impossible. And then, in a voice that was not a voice at all, more like a whisper that echoed in his mind, the figure spoke. "Leave or stay. The choice is yours." The words weren't comforting. They were a command. Alan's pulse quickened as the figure stepped closer, its form shifting like smoke in the air. He tried to step backward, but his body was still immobile. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, what this entity was. Was it a ghost? A manifestation of something dark? Or was it something older, something tied to the very soul of the train itself? The last thing Alan saw before his vision blacked out was the figure's hand, reaching toward him with unnerving slowness, as though savoring the moment. And then, nothing. The train continued its journey through the night, its wheels clattering over the tracks, carrying Alan's empty seat and the mystery of the entity in the engine room. It was just another Friday evening when Hannah and her two friends, Ryan and Lucy, boarded the 9:30 p.m. train from Central Station. The last train of the night, bound for a small town about 2 hours away. A late-night ride, after a long week, was nothing out of the ordinary. They had no idea that this ride would turn into something they would never forget, or that they would barely survive. As the train pulled out of the station, the trio settled into their seats. The rhythmic hum of the tracks was comforting, lulling them into a false sense of security. The carriage was quiet, save for the occasional muffled conversation from the other passengers. Everyone seemed half asleep, tired from their long days. It was the sort of atmosphere you'd expect from the last train of the night. A peaceful calm before sleep overtook the travelers. Hannah glanced at her phone, checking the time. It was 9:45 p.m. The train was on schedule, which was unusual for this route. Normally, there were delays, mechanical issues, or at least some kind of problem that would make the trip run late. But tonight, everything seemed too smooth. Ryan looked out the window, his face momentarily illuminated by the glow of passing station lights. "We're almost there, huh?" he asked, half to himself. Lucy, who had been scrolling through her phone, glanced up. "I don't know. Doesn't feel like we've been on the train for long." "That's because we're in the middle of nowhere," Ryan replied, pointing out the window. "Look, there's nothing for miles. Just trees and the occasional sign." But something was off. The landscape outside looked unfamiliar. In fact, nothing looked familiar. The passing stations were barely visible in the distance, their signs unreadable in the darkness. As the train picked up speed, it almost felt as if the world outside was being erased, swallowed up by the night. "Hey," Hannah said, tapping Ryan on the shoulder. "Where are we?" Ryan frowned, glancing around. "I don't know. I thought we were on the right track, but this doesn't look like the usual route." Lucy raised an eyebrow. "Maybe we missed our stop?" "Impossible," Hannah replied, her voice tinged with a hint of unease. "The train only makes one stop before a destination. We couldn't have missed it." Ryan pulled out his phone, trying to get a signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no Wi-Fi. The train's lights flickered for a second, and then everything returned to normal. But it wasn't just the lack of signal that unsettled him. There was a strange sense of disorientation in the air, like the train had somehow slipped out of sync with reality. They sat in silence for a few moments, unsure of what to make of the situation. Then, the overhead lights flickered again, and this time they stayed dimmed. The atmosphere in the carriage shifted. The air grew colder, heavier, like a storm was rolling in from nowhere. Hannah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "It's freezing in here." Lucy stood up, walking toward the door that led to the next car. "I'm going to ask the conductor if we're on the right train. Something feels off." As she reached the door, the train suddenly lurched, and the sound of the wheels on the tracks seemed to grow louder, more aggressive. Lucy hesitated, gripping the handle, but the door was locked. She shook it once, then twice. The door wouldn't budge. Ryan stood up, walking over to her. "What's going on?" "I can't open it," she said, voice strained. "It's like the train is sealed off." Hannah joined them, now standing by the door, looking out through the small glass window. "Look," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There's no platform. There's nothing. Just darkness." As the train continued its journey through the endless void, something strange began to happen. The passengers, who had been quietly minding their own business, started to stir. Their faces were pale, drawn, as if they hadn't slept in days. Some of them were staring at the trio, their eyes wide, vacant. Others seemed lost in thought, murmuring to themselves in low tones. One man, sitting near the front of the carriage, stood up suddenly, his movements jerky, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. He walked to the center of the aisle and stopped, staring directly at Ryan. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped, his voice hoarse and unnatural. "This train, it doesn't go where you think it does." Ryan's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen too much, someone who had been trapped in a nightmare for far too long. "You've boarded the ghost train. You'll never leave." The words hung in the air, thick with an oppressive weight. Hannah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "What does that mean?" she whispered. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and shuffled toward the back of the carriage, disappearing into the darkened corridor. The trio stood there, frozen. Was it a joke? A prank? Or was this something far more sinister? Before they could process what had just happened, the train gave another lurch, more violent this time. The lights flickered again, and the temperature dropped even further. Suddenly, the train jerked to an abrupt stop. It wasn't a smooth stop like the ones they were used to. It was a jarring halt that sent them stumbling forward. "Did we?" Ryan began, but his voice trailed off. There was no sign of the man, no sound of the train's usual stops, just the unnerving silence of the night. Hannah looked out the window again, her heart racing. The scenery outside had completely changed. They were no longer speeding through the countryside. Instead, they were surrounded by a dense fog, the kind that obscures everything, making it impossible to tell where the train was. The lights from the station, which had been visible earlier, were now nowhere to be seen. A faint sound echoed from the front of the train, a low, eerie hum that seemed to grow louder, resonating with a haunting, metallic undertone. Ryan's eyes widened. That's not normal. They turned toward the front of the train, the place where they had seen the conductor earlier. But now, the conductor's booth was empty. No one was in sight. And then, in the silence, it hit them. They were no longer on a train bound for a small town. They were on something else entirely, something far more sinister. As the train began to move again, this time slowly, almost deliberately, Hannah, Ryan, and Lucy understood. They weren't going anywhere. They weren't even sure they had left anywhere at all. And then, from somewhere far down the corridor, the unmistakable sound of a bell rang. It wasn't the usual ringing of a train's bell. It was a deep, resonating toll, like the bell of a church, or worse, the bell of a place where the dead rest. The train began to move again, but the sense of time was warped. They didn't know how long they'd been riding. Minutes? Hours? Days? It didn't matter. What mattered was that they were trapped. Trapped on a train that didn't stop, didn't go anywhere, and wasn't part of this world. And that, they soon realized, was the worst part. It was 3:13 a.m. when Henry boarded the train. Something about that time always seemed strange to him. The clock on the station platform flickered just as the train pulled in, its low hum cutting through the still night air. The 3:13 a.m. express was never on time, but it always arrived with precision, like a phantom that appeared out of nowhere, heading toward an unknown destination. Henry had just finished a long shift at the diner. Tired and disoriented, he rubbed his eyes as he stepped onto the cold, hard metal of the train's platform. He didn't know why he was getting on. It was the middle of the night, and he wasn't heading anywhere in particular. But the 3:13 a.m. express always seemed to have this magnetic pull. Inside, the train was nearly empty, save for a few tired passengers slumped in their seats, their eyes glazed over as though they were in some sort of trance. Henry chose a seat near the middle, the soft swish of the train's movement lulling him into a daze. The doors slid shut with an unnatural hiss, and the train began to move. A familiar chill filled the car as it accelerated, faster than usual. But Henry didn't think much of it. He was too tired. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks began to make his eyelids heavy. As the train sped down the darkened track, the lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows along the aisle. The air grew colder, and Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the usual nighttime silence. It was heavier, almost suffocating. It was as if the very air around him was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, the train slowed. The gentle hum of the wheels turned into an eerie screech. But it didn't stop. It kept moving, faster now, as if it were chasing something, pushing forward against a force that no one on board could understand. The windows offered no view of the outside, just the reflection of the dim lights overhead and the shape of passengers sitting motionless, their eyes glazed, as if they too were trapped in a dream that wouldn't end. Henry glanced around, noticing for the first time how strange the other passengers looked. They weren't just tired, they seemed out of place. There was a heaviness about them, a blankness that unnerved him, and one by one, their faces began to blur, their features distorting like the reflections in a funhouse mirror. A chill crept down his spine. Henry tried to stand, to shake off the unease gnawing at him, but his legs felt frozen. He looked at his watch. 3:13 a.m. He blinked, and then 3:13 a.m. again. The same minute, repeating, frozen in time. He heard a low, distorted voice coming from the intercom. The words were garbled, broken, as if the train itself were speaking from the depths of some otherworldly place. It wasn't clear what was being said, but Henry could swear he heard the name of the train, 3:13 a.m. Express, over and over again. He wanted to scream. He wanted to pull the emergency lever. But the more he tried to move, the more the train seemed to resist him. His limbs felt heavy, as though he were moving underwater. The other passengers didn't stir, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge the growing dread that filled the car. Suddenly, a shadow flickered at the far end of the car. Henry's heart raced as he saw a figure, tall, slender, and draped in a dark coat, standing at the far end of the train. It wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. The figure was just wrong. Its outline wavered like smoke, constantly shifting, constantly stretching, as if it were made of shadows. The figure's head turned slowly, and its eyes locked onto Henry's. His blood ran cold. It was then that he realized the truth. The 3:13 a.m. Express wasn't a normal train. It didn't follow the usual rules of time. It didn't belong to this world. The train wasn't headed anywhere. It was trapped in an eternal loop, a cycle from which there was no escape. The passengers weren't just asleep. They were dead. The distorted faces were not the result of tiredness or illusion. They were the faces of people who had boarded this train years ago, never to be seen again. Some had come from accidents, others from disappearances, victims who had stepped aboard, unaware of what they were truly boarding. And then there was the shadow, the figure in the dark coat. Henry didn't know if it was a conductor, a passenger, or something worse. But it wasn't human, and it wasn't here to help. The intercom crackled again, and a new voice, clearer this time, spoke. Next stop, nowhere. The train jerked violently, and the speed increased exponentially. The wind outside howled like the cries of lost souls, but still, the train refused to stop. It zoomed through the darkened tunnels, the vast, empty world outside swallowed up by the speed. And as Henry stared out of the window, something in the distance caught his eye. Another train, moving in the opposite direction, raced toward them. Its lights blindingly bright, but it too moved without slowing down, matching their pace. It came closer and closer until it was right outside his window, just inches away. He couldn't breathe. His heart hammered in his chest as the two trains moved side by side, locked in a chase through the void of time and space. For a moment, the two trains seemed to be locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, the other train vanished, disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the deafening roar of the train's engine. Henry's thoughts blurred, and then the 3:13 a.m. Express began to decelerate. The screeching wheels slowed, the distant howl of the wind ceased, and the air seemed to lift, leaving an eerie stillness behind. But just as Henry began to think it was over, just as he thought the nightmare would end, the intercom crackled once more. Next stop, nowhere. The train didn't stop. It never slowed down. It would never stop, never slow, always racing through the endless void, carrying its passengers toward an uncharted destination. And Henry was just another soul lost to the 3:13 a.m. Express, destined to ride the rails forever. It was supposed to be a normal evening commute, the kind of train ride you take without a second thought, the kind that blends into the mundane rhythm of everyday life. But that night was different. It began at the usual time, 7:30 p.m. sharp. Mark had just finished a late shift at the office, and like every other evening, he boarded the last train home. The platform was dim, the air crisp with the first hints of fall. The station, an old relic of the city's forgotten past, was mostly empty, save for a few tired commuters. The train was almost always on time, always reliable. But as he stepped aboard, something about it felt off. The interior was unusually quiet, the hum of the train's engine almost absent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The seats were far too clean, too new, for a train that had been in service for decades. Mark shook the feeling off, convincing himself it was just exhaustion. He found a seat by the window, next to a man in a worn-out coat who stared out at the passing scenery with an eerie stillness. Mark put in his earbuds, but the silence around him felt oppressive. No one spoke. Not a word. Not even a cough. The kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. It was the kind of quiet that made you want to break it to fill it with noise. But no one did. The train started to move, slowly at first, but quickly gaining speed. The city skyline began to fade into the distance, and soon, the buildings were replaced by open fields and darkened forests. He looked out the window. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting an unsettling glow over the empty landscape. Minutes passed, or was it hours? The strange quiet persisted. Mark checked his phone. No signal. The clock on the wall showed 7:50 p.m., a strange time anomaly for a train ride he had taken countless times before. He glanced around, but the passengers didn't seem to notice. They were all staring straight ahead, unblinking, as if they were in some kind of trance. That's when he noticed it. Up ahead, a small town appeared on the horizon. It wasn't there a moment ago. It wasn't on any map he had seen, not in any town guide or transit schedule. He could see the faint outline of buildings, dim streetlights, and rows of houses. The town looked old, abandoned even, with crumbling walls and boarded-up windows. The streets were eerily empty. He stood up and moved closer to the window, trying to get a better look. The train was speeding toward the town, but no one seemed to react. Not a single person stood or even looked out. It was as if they were all locked inside their own thoughts, unaware of what was happening outside. The town drew nearer, and Mark could make out the words on the rusted, worn-out sign at the town's entrance. Ferguson's Hollow. The name felt wrong. It didn't ring any bells. He had lived in this area his whole life, and he was certain no town called Ferguson's Hollow existed. He squinted his eyes, but the closer they got, the more distorted the scenery appeared. The houses weren't aligned properly. The streetlights flickered erratically as if malfunctioning, and there was something unnatural in the way the trees lined the streets. He glanced at the man sitting beside him. The man's eyes were wide, his face pale, his lips trembling. Without a word, the man slowly turned to look at Mark, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't want to get off here." "Don't get off." Mark's heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted toward the door as if considering it. But why would he get off? Why would anyone? The train slowed, and Mark could feel a growing sense of unease. The town was drawing closer. His mind raced with questions, but no answers came. His phone remained dead, the signal still non-existent. The air in the train grew thick, almost suffocating. He could hear the faintest whispers just beyond the hum of the train, but no one else seemed to react. And then the train stopped. The screech of the brakes echoed through the stillness, far too loud. Mark's heart raced. The train was now parked at the station in Ferguson's Hollow. He didn't remember the train ever making a stop here. The platform was dark, its lights dimmed and flickering. The station was completely empty. No one waiting to board, no one coming off. The door beside him slid open. The man beside him stood up, his movements jerky, unnatural. He turned to Mark, his eyes wide with a look of pure terror. "Get off now, or you'll never leave." But before Mark could react, the man stepped off the train. The moment his feet hit the platform, the door slammed shut behind him, and the train jolted forward again, picking up speed. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he watched the man standing there, the platform growing smaller in the distance. The man's face was filled with dread, his mouth open as if shouting something, though no sound reached Mark's ears. The lights of the station blinked out, one by one, swallowed by the darkness. The town, Ferguson's Hollow, was now far behind. But something stayed with Mark, something that didn't let go. The train moved faster and faster, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was following them, something that had been there, waiting. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The world outside the window became nothing but blackness, the trees, fields, and roads blending into a void. He couldn't even tell if they were still moving in the right direction. The door at the end of the carriage opened again. This time, it wasn't the man who had disappeared. It was a woman, a young woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face pale and gaunt. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps silent against the cold metal floor. She didn't seem to notice Mark, or the other passengers. Her eyes were vacant, unfocused, as if she were searching for something, someone. As she passed, Mark saw her mouth something, but the words were incomprehensible. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The train was no longer moving through the world he recognized. And then, suddenly, the train screeched to a halt once more. This time, the station ahead was nothing more than a dark silhouette in the distance. No name, no sign, only the shadow of a forgotten place. It was late, much later than the usual rush of travelers at the downtown train station. The air was thick with the hum of fluorescent lights flickering above, the scent of stale coffee lingering from the few remaining vendors. The station was almost empty now, with only a handful of tired souls milling about. Among them was Henry, a man with a simple purpose: to catch the last train home. He had just returned from a week-long business trip, and all he wanted was to relax in the quiet of his apartment. He glanced at his watch, feeling a bit anxious as the seconds ticked away. The station's waiting area, lined with rows of old wooden benches, felt colder than usual. Henry couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a strange tension in the air. As he waited near the luggage carousel, a peculiar sound drew his attention. A soft scraping sound, a noise that seemed to come from nowhere. Henry glanced around, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. The station was nearly empty now, with only a few people left waiting for the last train. But there was again the scraping sound. It was faint but unmistakable. He turned his head toward the luggage area, where a row of bags lay unattended. There was one in particular that caught his eye, a large, dark suitcase with a worn-out tag. It looked odd among the newer, cleaner bags, and it was moving just slightly, like it was shifting. Henry furrowed his brow. It wasn't much, just a subtle motion, but it was enough to stir an uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. He took a cautious step forward, narrowing his eyes. Was it his imagination, or was the luggage moving on its own? He approached cautiously, his footsteps slow and deliberate. As he neared the bag, it shifted again, this time much more obviously. It scraped across the floor of its own accord, dragging against the smooth surface of the terminal. Henry froze. His pulse quickened. At first, he thought it might be some sort of trick. Maybe the bag was just tilted awkwardly, and the vibrations from the station were causing it to move. But no, the suitcase was definitely shifting, inching slowly toward the edge of the platform. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest now, a cold chill creeping up his spine. With hesitant hands, Henry reached for his phone, preparing to take a picture, some kind of proof, just in case. But as his hand brushed against his pocket, a loud creak echoed across the room. The suitcase stopped moving. Henry stood there for a long moment, unable to look away. He wasn't sure what to do. Something about the entire situation felt off. He could see no logical explanation. The station was empty, and the bag shouldn't have been moving. It was as though it had a life of its own. Suddenly, he heard footsteps. The sound was heavy, deliberate, approaching fast. Henry turned sharply to find a man, dressed in a nondescript gray coat, walking briskly toward the luggage area. The man glanced briefly at the moving suitcase, then back at Henry. He didn't seem surprised or even curious, just calm, too calm. Without a word, the man walked past Henry, heading straight for the suitcase. His hand reached out, brushing against it as though he had done this 1,000 times before. And then, without explanation, the suitcase came to a complete stop. The man turned to face Henry, his expression unreadable. "You noticed, didn't you?" he said in a low voice, almost a whisper. Henry felt a wave of unease wash over him. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice shaky. The man simply nodded toward the suitcase, which now sat perfectly still, as though nothing had happened. "You don't belong here," the man said cryptically. "None of us do." Before Henry could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows of the station. As Henry stood there, still trying to make sense of what had just happened, he realized the station had grown even quieter. The air felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. That's when he heard it. Footsteps, faint but distinct, coming from the far end of the platform. They were slow, methodical, as if someone were walking toward him. He looked down at the suitcase again, almost as if it had some kind of gravitational pull on him. The bag seemed different now. Its once worn-out tag looked pristine, freshly stamped with a symbol Henry didn't recognize. His breath hitched as the suitcase began to move again, slowly at first, and then more purposefully. Henry could feel his legs going weak. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. He could barely move as the suitcase continued its slow, deliberate journey across the floor. Every inch it moved brought a deeper sense of dread. It wasn't just the suitcase that was unsettling, it was everything. The way the station seemed to close in around him, the eerie quiet, the way the man had vanished in a thin air. It felt wrong, as though something was watching him, waiting. Suddenly, the suitcase stopped moving again. But this time, it wasn't alone. A figure materialized in front of it, a dark silhouette of a man. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked onto Henry with an unsettling intensity. Henry couldn't look away. The figure seemed to be waiting for something. And then it happened. The suitcase lurched forward with sudden force, sliding toward the figure as though it were being pulled by some unseen force. A chill swept over Henry's entire body as the figure bent down, its hands reaching toward the suitcase. The air around him grew cold, and Henry felt a sense of dread so thick it nearly suffocated him. He wanted to scream, to run, to flee this nightmare. But the figure, whoever or whatever it was, wasn't finished. As the figure knelt to open the suitcase, the lights above flickered once more, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally. The suitcase creaked open. Henry could barely make out the shape inside, an object wrapped in old cloth. But just as quickly as it opened, the suitcase slammed shut with a deafening thud, and the figure disappeared into the darkness. And just like that, the station returned to silence. The luggage, still unnaturally still, was left as a silent testament to whatever strange, unexplainable event had just occurred. There was no explanation, no logique, just the lingering feeling that something beyond the ordinary had touched that place. The suitcase would stay, unmoved by the time that passed, with no one ever coming to claim it. The trains kept running. The station carried on its duties. But the luggage remained, a silent mystery, waiting for the next curious traveler.